The rain came down sideways that Tuesday evening in Birmingham, Alabama, the kind of cold November rain that soaked through cheap sneakers and made the cracked asphalt of Jefferson Avenue shimmer under the flickering streetlights. Marcus Johnson pulled his thin gray hoodie tighter around his shoulders, the fabric already heavy with water, clinging to his 15-year-old frame like a second skin. His breath came out in white puffs as he hurried past the boarded-up storefronts, the closed-down barber shop where his daddy used to get his fade before the cancer took him 3 years back, past the corner store with the bulletproof glass and the old men who nodded at him because they remembered his grandmother. In his pocket, folded twice and pressed flat against a crumpled receipt, was a single $10 bill. That $10 was supposed to be groceries. That $10 was supposed to be the eggs and the loaf of day-old bread. And maybe, if he was lucky, a can of the off-brand soup his little sister Keisha liked, the one with the alphabet noodles she'd spell her name with before she ate it. His grandmother Pearl had handed him that bill at the kitchen table with hands that trembled now in ways they hadn't last spring, her thumb pressing hard against his palm like she was sealing a promise. "Don't lose it, baby. Don't you lose it." He wasn't going to lose it. He was going to walk the 11 blocks to the Save-A-Lot on 15th Street, and he was going to come home with food, and Keisha was going to eat something warm before bed. That was the plan. Then he saw her. She was standing under the broken awning of the old laundromat, the one that had been shuttered since the summer, a young woman in a thin tan coat that wasn't built for this kind of cold, her arms wrapped tight around a small boy who couldn't have been more than 4 years old. The boy was crying, that exhausted, whimpering kind of cry kids do when they've already been crying for hours, and the woman was bouncing him gently, whispering something into his wet hair. Beside them on the cracked concrete sat 2 plastic grocery bags stuffed with what looked like clothes, a stuffed rabbit poking out of the top of one. Their car, a beat-up burgundy sedan, sat dead at the curb with its hazard lights blinking weak orange flashes into the rain, the hood still cracked open like somebody had given up trying to figure it out. Marcus slowed down. He shouldn't have. He knew better than to slow down on Jefferson Avenue after dark. His grandmother had drilled that into him since he was old enough to walk to school alone. Keep your head down. Keep moving, mind your business. But the boy was crying, and the woman looked up just then, and her eyes met his across the wet sidewalk, and Marcus saw something in them he recognized too well. Tired, scared, the kind of scared that comes from running out of options. Man, listen, what this boy did next, with his last $10 in his pocket and his sister waiting at home hungry, it changed everything. Stay with me, because you're not going to believe how this story ends. Marcus stopped walking. The rain hammered down on his hood, pooling cold against the back of his neck, and for a long moment he just stood there 10 feet away from the woman, his sneakers sinking slightly into a puddle that had swallowed the curb. She didn't ask him for anything. That was the thing that got him. She didn't even open her mouth. She just held her boy a little tighter and turned her face away, like she was used to people walking past her, like she'd already given up expecting kindness from strangers. The little boy buried his face in her coat, and Marcus could see the way her shoulders were shaking, not from crying, but from cold, that deep, bone-shaking cold that sets in when you've been outside too long in clothes that aren't enough. Marcus thought about Keisha. He thought about the empty refrigerator at home, the pilot light on the stove that kept going out, the way his grandmother coughed in her sleep now. He thought about that $10 bill folded in his pocket, the weight of it suddenly feeling like a brick. He thought about turning around and walking the other way. Then he thought about his daddy, James Johnson, who'd worked construction his whole life and never once turned away a man who needed help, who used to say that a person's worth wasn't measured by what they had, but by what they were willing to give when they didn't have much. His daddy, who died in a hospital bed, holding Marcus's hand and telling him to take care of his sister and his grandmother and to remember who he was. Marcus walked over. The woman flinched a little when he stepped under the awning, just a small involuntary flinch, and Marcus held his hands up the way you'd approach a scared animal. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice cracked because he was 15 and cold and scared too. "Ma'am, are y'all all right?" She looked at him properly then, really looked at him, and Marcus saw she was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25, with tired brown eyes and a small scar above her eyebrow. "My car broke down," she said softly, and her voice was hoarse like she'd been holding back tears for a long time. "We've been here 3 hours. My phone died. I don't know anybody in this city. We were just passing through." The little boy peeked out from her coat then, his eyes wide and wet, and Marcus felt something break open in his chest. He pulled the $10 bill out of his pocket. His fingers were so cold he almost dropped it. The woman saw what he was doing and immediately started shaking her head. "No, no, baby, you keep that. I can't take that from you." But Marcus pressed it into her hand anyway, folded her fingers around it the same way his grandmother had folded his. "There's a diner 2 blocks down," he said. "Miss Ruby's place. She's open till midnight. You can get him something hot to eat and use the phone. Tell her Pearl Johnson's grandson sent you. She'll let you sit there long as you need." The woman stared at him. Her eyes filled up, and the tears came fast, mixing with the rain on her cheeks. She tried to give the bill back. She tried twice, but Marcus just shook his head and stepped back, his hands jammed deep in his pockets now where the $10 used to be. And he gave her the kind of small smile his daddy used to give people, the smile that said, "It's all right. We're all right, just go." "What's your name?" she asked him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus Johnson." She looked down at the bill in her hand and then back up at him, and she said, "I'm Andrea. This is my son David. Marcus, I don't know how to thank you." Marcus shrugged, the way teenage boys do when they don't know what to say, and he told her to get inside before the boy caught his death of cold. Then he turned and started walking, not toward the grocery store anymore, because there was no point now, but back the way he'd come, back toward home, back toward the conversation he was going to have with his grandmother about why he'd come back empty-handed. The walk home was the longest 11 blocks of his life. The rain didn't let up. By the time he climbed the cracked concrete steps of the duplex on Sycamore Street, his teeth were chattering so hard he could barely get the key in the lock. Inside, the house smelled like the eucalyptus oil his grandmother rubbed on her chest at night, and the small space heater in the living room glowed orange in the corner. Keisha was on the couch in her pajamas with the bunny on them, watching cartoons on the old television with the antenna wrapped in tin foil. She looked up when he came in, and her face lit up the way little sisters' faces do, and she said, "Did you bring soup?" Marcus opened his mouth and nothing came out. From the kitchen, his grandmother's voice called, "That you, baby?" He took off his soaked hoodie and hung it over the radiator. He walked into the kitchen on legs that felt like lead. Pearl Johnson was sitting at the table in her faded blue housecoat, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, sorting through a small stack of bills with a yellow legal pad beside her. She looked up at him, and her eyes went straight to his empty hands, and her face changed in a way he'd seen before, the way it changed every time something else went wrong, every time the universe took one more thing from them. "Marcus," she said quietly, "where are the groceries?" He sat down across from her. He told her everything. He told her about Andrea and David and the broken down car and the way the little boy had been crying and how he'd given the $10 away and how he was sorry. He was so sorry. But he just couldn't walk past them, Grandma. He just couldn't. His daddy wouldn't have walked past them. Pearl listened in silence, her hands folded on the legal pad, her face unreadable. When he finished, she didn't say anything for a long time. Then she got up slowly, the way she got up now because her hip wasn't right anymore, and she walked around the table, and she put her arms around him, and she pulled him tight against her chest, and she said, "Baby, you did right. You did exactly right, and your daddy would be so proud." That night, they ate what was in the cupboards, which wasn't much, a pot of grits with butter and a sleeve of crackers, and Keisha didn't complain because Pearl told her a story about how grits used to be the king's food in Africa. And Keisha believed her, the way little sisters believe their grandmothers. Marcus lay awake that night on his thin mattress in the room he shared with no one since his daddy passed, listening to the rain finally slowing down on the roof. And he thought about Andrea and David and hoped they'd made it somewhere safe. He didn't know yet that he'd just changed the entire trajectory of his life. He didn't know who Andrea was. The next morning of the Wednesday, and Wednesdays meant Lincoln High School, which sat on the rougher side of Birmingham, a sprawling brick building from the 1950s with hallways that smelled like floor wax and despair. Marcus had been a sophomore for 2 months. He kept his head down, made decent grades, ran track in the spring, and tried not to be noticed by the kids who liked to notice the wrong kind of people. His best friend was a kid named Terrence, who lived 2 streets over and wanted to be an engineer, and the two of them ate lunch together every day in the corner of the cafeteria near the vending machine that hadn't worked since 2019. Lincoln High had a principal named Dr. Whitaker, a tall man with a habit of straightening his tie, even when it didn't need straightening, and a vice principal named Mr. Calloway, who everybody, students and teachers alike, quietly hated. Mr. Calloway was a thin, pale man in his late 40s with rimless glasses and a smile that never reached his eyes. And he had a particular way of speaking to certain students, the ones who looked like Marcus, the ones whose parents didn't show up to PTA meetings because they were working 2 jobs. He used a tone with them that he didn't use with the kids from the wealthier zip codes that had been redistricted into Lincoln 3 years back. He'd stand in the hallway during passing period with his arms crossed, and he'd find reasons. Dress code violations that weren't really violations. Tardies for kids who weren't actually tardy. Loud voices that hadn't actually been loud. He had a clipboard, and he wrote things down on that clipboard, and the things he wrote down had a way of becoming permanent records. Marcus had been on Mr. Calloway's clipboard 3 times that semester for what Mr. Calloway called attitude problems, which mostly meant Marcus had answered a question without smiling enough. That Wednesday morning, Marcus was sitting in second period algebra when Mr. Calloway's voice came over the intercom. That thin, reedy voice everybody dreaded. And it said, "Marcus Johnson, please report to the principal's office immediately." The classroom got that quiet it gets when somebody's been called down. 20 pairs of eyes swung toward Marcus. The teacher, Mrs. Henderson, looked confused because Marcus wasn't the kind of kid who got called down. Marcus picked up his backpack with hands that were suddenly cold. He walked out of that classroom, not knowing that when he walked back into Lincoln High School, the entire building, the entire city, the entire trajectory of his small, struggling life was about to be different forever. The walk to the principal's office took 3 minutes, and Marcus spent every single one of those minutes trying to figure out what he'd done. He hadn't been in any fights. He hadn't talked back to anybody. He'd worn the right kind of belt that morning, he'd checked. He went through every interaction he'd had over the past week, every word, every look, and came up with nothing. By the time he turned the corner into the main hallway, his stomach was a tight knot, and his palms were sweating against the straps of his backpack. He saw the cars before he saw the people. Through the long row of windows that ran along the front of the school, the windows that looked out onto the circular driveway and the flagpole in the visitor parking lot, Marcus saw something he had never seen in his life. A line of black cars. Not just any black cars. Long, polished, gleaming black cars, the kind that cost more than houses in his neighborhood. The kind he'd only ever seen on television. There were 6 of them, parked in a perfect convoy along the curb, and standing beside them were men in dark suits with earpieces, the kind of men who scanned the area with their hands clasped in front of them. Other students had started gathering at the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, their voices rising in confused excitement. A teacher was trying to shoo them back to class without much success. Marcus stopped walking. His brain couldn't connect what he was seeing with the fact that he had just been called down to the office. They weren't related. They couldn't be related. Things like that didn't happen to kids like him. Then Mr. Calloway appeared at the end of the hallway, and Mr. Calloway's face was something Marcus had never seen before. A strange mixture of confusion and barely contained panic. His thin lips pressed into a line, his rimless glasses slightly fogged. He saw Marcus, and something flickered behind those glasses. Something calculating. "Mr." Calloway walked toward him with quick clipped steps. "Marcus," he said, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be very honest with me. Have you been making contact with anyone, any adults outside the school, regarding any complaints or concerns about Lincoln High?" Marcus blinked at him. "No, sir," he said. Mr. Calloway's eyes narrowed. "Are you sure, Marcus? Because there are some very important people here, and they have specifically asked for you. And if you have made any false accusations or exaggerations about your treatment at this school, I want you to understand that there are very serious consequences for that kind of behavior." Marcus felt that thing happen in his chest, that thing that happened every time Mr. Calloway talked to him this way, that hot, tight feeling of being accused of something he hadn't done. "I haven't done anything, sir," he said, his voice steady even though his hands were shaking. "I don't even know what's going on." Mr. Calloway studied him for another long moment, like he was deciding whether to believe him. Then he straightened his tie and he said, "Follow me, Marcus, and try to remember everything we've talked about regarding respectful behavior." They walked together toward the principal's office. The hallway felt a mile long. Marcus could hear the murmur of voices behind the closed door of Dr. Whitaker's office, low and serious. He could feel the weight of every clipboard mark Mr. Calloway had ever made on him pressing down on his shoulders. He still didn't understand. He was still putting the pieces together when Mr. Calloway opened the door and stepped aside, and Marcus walked into that office and saw who was waiting for him. The first person Marcus saw was Dr. Whitaker, standing behind his desk with his hands folded in front of him, his face a careful mask of professional neutrality. The second person he saw was a tall white man in a charcoal suit with silver hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything in the room at once. A man Marcus didn't recognize, but who carried himself like someone used to, being the most important person wherever he stood. The third person Marcus saw made his knees almost give out. Sitting in one of the leather chairs across from the desk in a cream-colored dress with her hair pulled back and a small silver cross at her throat was Andrea. Beside her, in a tiny pair of khaki pants and a navy sweater, holding the same stuffed rabbit Marcus had seen poking out of the plastic bag the night before, was David. Andrea stood up when Marcus walked in. Her eyes were wet again, but they were different wet now, not the tired, scared wet from the night before, but something softer, something proud. "Marcus," she said. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway. His backpack slid down off one shoulder. He looked at Andrea, and at David, and at the silver-haired man, and at Dr. Whitaker, and he tried to make his mouth work and couldn't. The silver-haired man stepped forward then, and he extended his hand, and he said, "Marcus Johnson, my name is Robert Caldwell. I'm Andrea's father. Marcus, his daughter has told me what you did for her last night." Marcus shook the man's hand on autopilot. The man's grip was firm and warm. Marcus said, She was? The boy was cold, sir." Robert Caldwell smiled, and his smile was the kind of smile that came from way down deep, from somewhere private. "Yes," he said, "he was. And you gave them your last $10, Marcus. Did you know that?" Marcus didn't say anything. Robert Caldwell looked at his daughter, and his daughter nodded. And then Robert Caldwell looked back at Marcus, and he said, "Andrea is my only child. After her mother died 8 years ago, Andrea is what I have." Last night she was driving to visit a college friend, and her car broke down in a part of the city where I had told her not to go alone, and her phone was dead. And she was stranded in the rain with my grandson, who is also the only grandson I have. And not one person stopped, Marcus. Not one car, not one passerby until you. Marcus felt something hot building behind his eyes, and he tried very hard to hold it back, because he was 15, and you didn't cry in the principal's office in front of strangers. From his chair behind the desk, Dr. Whitaker cleared his throat and said, "Marcus, Mr. Caldwell asked to speak with you specifically this morning. He has, made some requests of the school that we are reviewing." Robert Caldwell turned slowly toward Dr. Whitaker, and the temperature in the room changed. "Reviewing," he said, in a tone that was perfectly polite and absolutely not polite. "We're not reviewing anything, Dr. Whitaker. We are doing it, all of it, Mr." Calloway, who had slipped into the room behind Marcus, made a small sound like he'd swallowed wrong. Robert Caldwell turned to him next, and the silver-haired man's face had gone very still. "And you must be Vice Principal Calloway," he said. Calloway nodded jerkily. "We have a great deal to discuss, the two of us. A great deal." Marcus stood there in the middle of the office, and he had no idea what was happening, but he could feel it, the way you can feel a storm rolling in, the pressure changing, the air going strange. Something big was about to happen. Something very, very big. Robert Caldwell, as Marcus would learn over the course of that morning, was the chairman and chief executive officer of Caldwell Industries, a Birmingham-based engineering and construction conglomerate that employed 11,000 people across the southeastern United States. He was, by any reasonable measure, one of the wealthiest men in Alabama. He was also the largest single private donor to the Birmingham public school system, a fact that he had never publicized and that almost no one outside the district administration knew. He had given Lincoln High School, the school his grandson would never attend and his daughter had never set foot in until that morning, more than $4 million over the past decade. Money for science labs and library books and football equipment and a music program that Mr. Calloway had quietly defunded 2 years ago in favor of what he called efficiency reallocations. Robert Caldwell had not known about the music program. Robert Caldwell, sitting in that principal's office that Wednesday morning, was about to find out about a great many things he had not known. Andrea had told her father everything. About the rain, about the broken-down car, about David crying and the cold setting in, about the boy in the gray hoodie who had walked over and pressed a $10 bill into her hand and walked away without giving her a chance to refuse it. about sitting in Miss Ruby's diner 2 blocks down, where the woman behind the counter had taken one look at her and David and brought them hot soup and grilled cheese sandwiches and refused to take Andrea's money, refused even after Andrea explained that a young man named Marcus Johnson had given her $10 to spend there. Miss Ruby had laughed and said, "Child, that boy's grandmother used to braid my daughter's hair when we couldn't afford a salon. Your money's no good in here." Andrea had used the diner phone to call her father. Her father had sent a car. He had brought her home, gotten David warm and fed and tucked into bed, and then he had sat with his daughter at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning while she cried and told him about the boy who had nothing and had given her everything. Robert Caldwell had not slept that night. He had made phone calls. He had used the resources at his disposal, which were significant, to find out everything he could about Marcus Johnson, age 15, of Sycamore Street, Birmingham, Alabama. He had learned about James Johnson, the construction worker who had died of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago after a fight with a hospital insurance company that had denied his treatments. He had learned about Pearl Johnson, 68, who worked part-time as a housekeeper at a hotel downtown and was raising her 2 grandchildren on her late husband's Social Security and what little she could earn. He had learned about Keisha, age 7, 2nd grade. He had also learned about Lincoln High School. He had pulled records, asked questions, made calls to people who owed him favors and people who didn't. By the time the sun came up that Wednesday morning, Robert Caldwell had a folder on his desk that was 3 inches thick. He had read every page. He had then made one more phone call, and at 8:45 a.m., a convoy of black cars had pulled up in front of Lincoln High School. Now in the principal's office, Robert Caldwell pulled a leather folder from the briefcase beside his chair, and he set it on Dr. Whitaker's desk, and he opened it. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice quiet and absolutely calm, "I'd like to ask you about a young man named Marcus Johnson and the disciplinary record you have constructed for him over the past 14 months. Calloway's face went the color of old paper. What followed in that office over the next 90 minutes was the kind of thing that would later be talked about in faculty rooms and barbershops and church basements all across Birmingham for years. Robert Caldwell did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He sat in that leather chair with the folder open in front of him, and one by one, with the patience of a man who had built his fortune on knowing every detail, he walked through Marcus Johnson's disciplinary record. "Tardy on October 14th, he said, reading from the folder. "Marcus, do you remember that day?" Marcus, who was sitting now in a chair Andrea had pulled over for him, nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. The bus was late. There was an accident on 12th Street. Robert Caldwell nodded. "The bus was late. 3 other students from your bus route were marked tardy that day, Mr. Calloway. 2 of them had the marks excused after providing the standard bus delay form. Marcus did not. Why is that?" Calloway opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I don't," he said. "I would have to look at the individual circumstances." "I have looked at them," said Robert Caldwell. "Dress code violation, October 23rd. The infraction listed is, quote, sagging pants. Marcus, were you sagging your pants?" Marcus shook his head. "No, sir." "They're a size too big because," he hesitated, "because they were my dad's." Robert Caldwell paused for just a moment, then he continued. 6 other students were cited for dress code violations that week. All 6 were, like Marcus, students of color from the Sycamore Street and Jefferson Avenue corridors. None of the students from the Brookside or Mountain Vista zip codes received any citations during that period, despite a documented complaint from a teacher named Mrs. Marquez about ripped jeans and crop tops in her 4th period class. Dr. Whitaker, were you aware of this disparity? Dr. Whitaker, who had been silent and increasingly pale throughout, said carefully, I was not, Mr. Caldwell. Robert Caldwell nodded, and he kept going. He went through every entry. The attitude problem citations that had no specific behavior listed, the detentions assigned for offenses that other students had committed without consequence. The pattern, when laid out across the months, was undeniable. Mr. Calloway had, with surgical precision, been building a paper case against Marcus Johnson, a case that would, at the end of the semester, justify a recommendation for transfer to the alternative school across town. The school where kids went and didn't come back. Marcus didn't know that part yet. He sat in his chair with his hands clenched in his lap, and he listened to a man he didn't know read out, in calm, even tones, 14 months of small humiliations he had absorbed without ever fully understanding the shape of them. Andrea was crying quietly in the next chair, one hand over her mouth. David sat in her lap with his rabbit, watching with wide, quiet eyes. Mr. Calloway, said Robert Caldwell finally, closing the folder, I have one question for you. Why? Mr. Calloway didn't answer. His thin, pale hands gripped the arms of his chair. Sweat had broken out along his hairline. Why this boy? Robert Caldwell said, in the same quiet voice. What did this child do to deserve 14 months of your attention? Calloway said nothing. There was nothing to say. Dr. Whitaker, Robert Caldwell continued, turning. I will be in contact with the superintendent this afternoon. Mr. Calloway will not be returning to this building. Furthermore, he paused and he looked at Marcus. Furthermore, I have several other matters I would like to discuss with you and with the school board regarding this institution and what is going to happen here from this point forward. By the time Marcus walked out of that office, his head was spinning so hard he had to put his hand on the wall to steady himself. Andrea had hugged him before he left, a tight, quick hug, and she had whispered thank you again. And David had given him the rabbit to hold for a second, which was apparently the highest honor a 4-year-old could bestow. Robert Caldwell had shaken his hand and told him he would be in touch very soon. Mr. Calloway had been escorted out a different door by one of the men in suits, and he had not looked at Marcus once. Dr. Whitaker had asked Marcus to please return to class, and to please not discuss the contents of the meeting with other students for the time being. And Marcus had nodded, because he wasn't sure he could have explained any of it anyway. He walked back through the hallways in a daze. Other kids stared at him. Word had already spread that the convoy of black cars was somehow connected to Marcus Johnson, and people were looking at him with a mix of curiosity and something like awe. By lunch, the cars were gone, but the whispers weren't. Terrence found him in the cafeteria and sat down across from him with his eyes wide as dinner plates. Bro, Terrence said, bro. What happened? Marcus tried to explain. He couldn't really, not yet, not in a way that made sense. He just said, I helped somebody last night, and it turned out they knew people. Terrence stared at him. They knew people, he repeated. Marcus, them was Caldwell cars out front. You know who Caldwell is. Marcus knew now. That afternoon, when Marcus got home from school, there was a black car parked outside his grandmother's duplex. His stomach lurched. He climbed the steps and opened the door, and there in the small living room, sitting on the couch with a mug of coffee in her hand and his grandmother across from her in the recliner, was Andrea. Pearl looked up when Marcus came in, and her eyes were wet, and she said, Baby, come sit down. Andrea had come herself. She had insisted, she explained, because she had wanted to thank Pearl in person. and because there were some things she and her father wanted to talk to the family about, if they were willing to hear them. Robert Caldwell would come by that evening, she said, after work, if that was all right. Pearl, who had been raised in a generation that did not let strangers leave hungry, asked if Andrea would stay for some tea. Andrea said yes. They sat in that small living room for an hour, and Andrea told Pearl everything. The broken-down car, the rain, the $10. Pearl held Marcus's hand the entire time. When Andrea got to the part about the principal's office that morning, Pearl's face got very still, the same stillness she had worn at her son's funeral, and she looked at Marcus and she said, "Baby, you didn't tell me they were doing that to you at school." Marcus shrugged, the way he always shrugged when he didn't want to make her worry. "Wasn't anything to tell, Grandma. It was just Mr. Calloway." Pearl shook her head slowly. Baby. That was something to tell? Andrea reached over and squeezed Pearl's other hand. "Mrs. Johnson," she said, "we want to make some things right. If you'll let us." Pearl looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Child, I don't know your daddy, and I don't know about making things right, but I know my grandson did what was right last night, because that's how he was raised. Whatever else happens, that's the truth of it." Robert Caldwell came at 7 that evening. He brought groceries, not just a few bags, but enough to fill the kitchen, real groceries, the kind Pearl hadn't bought in years, fresh vegetables and good meat, and a whole box of the alphabet soup Keisha liked. He brought it in himself, in his shirt sleeves, and he set it on the kitchen counter, and when Pearl tried to protest, he just held up his hand and said, "Ma'am, I am a guest in your home, and I would like to do this for you, please." Pearl let him. They sat down at the kitchen table, all of them, Robert and Andrea and David and Pearl and Marcus and Keisha, and Pearl made tea, and Robert Caldwell told them what he wanted to do. He wanted to set up a college fund for Marcus and Keisha, full scholarships to any school they could get into, with living expenses included. He wanted to hire Pearl, if she was willing, in a position with Caldwell Industries that he had been trying to fill for some time, a community liaison position with full benefits and a salary that would let her stop working 2 jobs immediately. He wanted to pay off the small mortgage on the duplex. He wanted, he said, to make sure that what had almost happened to Marcus at Lincoln High School never happened to another child in that school again. And he had ideas about that too. But those ideas would take time, and the school board, and probably some lawyers. Pearl listened to all of it without saying a word. When he finished, she set down her teacup very carefully, and she looked at him. And she said, "Mr. Caldwell?" He said, "Please, ma'am, call me Robert." She said, "Robert, I appreciate everything you're saying. I want you to know that. But I want to tell you something. My grandson did not give your daughter $10 because he was hoping for any of this. He gave her $10 because that is who he is. And I do not want him, or his sister, or me to ever feel that we are taking charity." Robert Caldwell nodded slowly. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "I understand. And I want you to know something also. I am not offering charity. I am offering," he paused, looking for the word, "I am offering correction. The world, ma'am, did not treat your son fairly. The world is not treating your grandson fairly, at his school or otherwise. I am one man, and I cannot fix all of that. But I can do these things for this family because your grandson did something for my family that no amount of money can ever repay. This is not charity. This is what should have been already." Pearl was quiet for a long time. Then she nodded, just once, and she said, "All right, Robert, all right." 2 weeks later, Mr. Calloway was officially fired from Lincoln High School after an emergency school board meeting that Robert Caldwell attended personally with the folder under his arm. The board's review of Calloway's disciplinary records over the previous 5 years uncovered a clear and documented pattern of bias against students of color from specific neighborhoods. 3 other students who had been transferred to the alternative school under Calloway's recommendation were brought back to Lincoln with their records expunged. A new vice principal was hired, a Black woman named Dr. Yvonne Reeves, who had taught at Lincoln 20 years earlier and had left because, as she told Marcus on her first day, the place had broken her heart. She was back to fix it. The music program came back, so did the after-school tutoring. Robert Caldwell didn't put his name on any of it, but everyone knew. Marcus's life changed, slowly and then all at once. He kept his head down, kept his grades up, kept running track in the spring. He started staying late after school in the new tutoring program, helping younger kids with their math, because Dr. Reeves had asked him to, and because he liked it. Pearl took the job at Caldwell Industries, and within a year, she was running a community outreach program that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with what Robert had called correction. She bought herself a new pair of glasses and she stopped coughing in her sleep. Keisha got the alphabet soup whenever she wanted it, and she spelled her whole name, and her brother's name, and her grandmother's name, and her daddy's name in the bowl before she ate. Andrea and David moved back to Birmingham permanently, and David started calling Marcus his big brother, which made Marcus laugh the first time and made him quiet the second time. The two families had dinner together every Sunday. Robert Caldwell was at every track meet Marcus ran. 2.5 years later, Marcus Johnson graduated from Lincoln High School as the valedictorian of his class. He gave a speech at the ceremony that he had written himself, a speech about a rainy night and a $10 bill and his daddy and his grandmother and the way that the smallest decisions, the ones nobody is watching, are the ones that build a person. Pearl was in the front row in a new blue dress. Keisha was beside her, 10 years old now and missing a front tooth. Andrea was there with David, who was almost 7 and had brought the rabbit. Robert Caldwell was there in a charcoal suit. And when Marcus said the line about his father, the line about how James Johnson had taught him that a man's worth wasn't measured by what he had, but by what he was willing to give when he didn't have much, Robert Caldwell quietly took off his glasses and wiped his eyes. Marcus went to college that fall. He went to Morehouse on the full scholarship Robert had set up, but had then declined to let Robert pay for, because Marcus had earned an academic scholarship of his own, and he wanted his name to mean what his name meant. He studied civil engineering, like he had planned ever since he was small, and his daddy used to take him to construction sites on Saturdays. He came home every break. He took Keisha out for ice cream. He sat with Pearl on the porch, and they talked about nothing and everything. Mr. Calloway left education and was last reported to be selling insurance in another state. He never apologized to Marcus, and Marcus stopped waiting for him to. Some people, Pearl told him, can't say sorry because saying sorry would mean looking at themselves, and they would rather die than do that, so they just keep going. You don't need his sorry, baby. You got something better. You got your life. So that's the story, y'all. A boy with $10 in his pocket and a sister waiting at home stopped on a rainy night because somebody else was colder than he was. He didn't know who he was helping. He didn't expect anything back. He just did what his daddy taught him to do. And the universe, in the strange way the universe sometimes does, took notice. If this story moved you, If you believe that small acts of kindness matter, that integrity still counts for something in this world, do me a favor and hit that like button. Share this with somebody who needs to hear it today, and let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you'd been Marcus that night? Stay kind out there. Stay generous. You never know whose life you're about to walk into, and you never know who's watching.